Welcome back to another Gaming Memories video. Here we are taking a look at Fighter's Impact that was actually released on the PlayStation in 1996. Now I remember back when I was playing the PlayStation, there was actually quite a lot of fighting games that were actually being released on the system. Even just in the whole 32-bit era back in those early days, there's a lot of arcade type fighters were really big at the time. I remember even the likes of even the Sega Saturn actually had a lot of fighting games, so the PlayStation obviously was in competition and had its own unique style of fighting games too. So Fighter's Impact, I don't remember too much about it. I never really seen it. I don't even know for sure if it was actually released in Europe. I presume that it was, because there's a lot of games like I mentioned like that were actually available, but a lot of the times I didn't even know anything about them. I was completely oblivious to them. And again, they were all different in their own ways, but they all at the same time were kind of very similar in a lot of other ways too. Because if you played one type of fighting game that was like this here, chances are a lot of the other fighting games will kind of remind you of them as well. And this here game is actually no different. This game actually does heavily remind me of the likes of the early Virtua Fighter games, like on the likes of the arcade at Sega Saturn. But it also reminds me an awful lot of like even other fighting games in that era, like Fighting Vipers and even Battle Arena Toshinden and all those type of games. There was actually Tekken at the time, but Tekken felt very different compared to these type of games. So it did. These here were definitely way more arcade style type of fighters. They had similar kind of like styles and how they controlled and the movesets and so forth. So by actually playing this here, it reminds me an awful lot of, especially more so, the Virtua Fighter games, if I'll be honest. So again, the whole era around say 95, 96, 97, there was a lot of these type of fighting games that were made available for both the PlayStation and the Sega Saturn, and they had very similar types of play styles. Even the movesets, a lot of the combat systems and physics were very, very similar as well. So they had a very arcadey type of feel. Now they were decent games, they were actually really good. This one here now I never actually got to play back in the day, because again I had heard of it but I didn't really know if you could actually get it, like I mentioned. But I've got to say, for the purpose of this video, I've managed to get the chance to actually play it, and it does remind me of a lot of those type of games. It does take a little bit of getting used to get used to the game mechanics, the physics and the controls, but it's actually a decent fighting game. It works very well once you can get the moves to actually work. It actually does do quite well, and there's a lot of really, really good kind of like combat mechanics and move styles and so forth, and you can change your stances as well during the fight so that you can actually use more type of combat moves and different kind of techniques, which is pretty cool. But again, like as with a lot of these fighting games, it gets more difficult the more you actually play it. Especially when you go through the campaigns, the difficulty increases with each fight. So it gets to a point where it actually becomes extremely difficult if you don't really know or understand a lot of the movesets to actually defeat a lot of the enemies. If at most points, even if I go back to even like the old Mortal Kombat games, it used to be nearly almost impossible to actually beat enemies, because every move that you did, especially in the harder difficulties, they could predict every single move that you were able to do, so we were able to counter everything. So it was very, very difficult to actually win a match, and this here was no different. From my first playthrough, I managed to get through the first couple of fights with relative ease, but then it got to a point where it actually became ridiculous. I actually couldn't actually win a fight then after that. So, but that's the way these games were actually developed, that's the way they were created. Because when you look back in the mid-90s era of console and even arcade games, fighting games were actually a really huge thing. There was so many different types of fighting games out there. All major games companies were all trying to literally get their foot in the door with trying to compete against big brands. Because you had the likes of the Tekken franchise on the PlayStation, which was technically the flagship fighting series on the PlayStation at the time. and you can see that with the evidence of the sequels, especially with Tekken 3, which is considered one of the best fighting games of all time. It's probably the best fighting game actually on the PS3, and it's definitely my favourite of all the Tekken series, hands down. Actually, excellent game. And you can see where a lot of these games are trying to come up with their own styles. This game, from what I've been able to play and from what I've been able to find out about as well, it is unique in its own way for its time, because you're not restricted to any type of combo sets, because like I mentioned, you can change a character's alteration, or you can change the position at any given time, and allows you to actually kind of make up your own type of combo sets. Because the one thing I did learn about it, like saying, the game does get more difficult, but the one thing I've realised as well too is that the computer controlled characters actually starts to learn your move patterns and how you actually attack them, so they know how to block them and even counter them as you go on. So it was quite unique and quite smart for its time, but that's what made the game a lot more challenging and obviously more difficult. But these games were actually pretty cool. The only thing is I will say is, because there was that many of them, when you, like I mentioned earlier in the video, when you've played one, you pretty much have played them all, because there was that many of them. It was just you were completely whitewashed with the amount of fighting games. But I suppose it was the big trend back in the day. It really was, and having fighting games on consoles really kind of definitely brought the arcade kind of vibe to literally your living room in that sense. So there was definitely a lot there to actually have, and you had your choices. There was any amount of types of fighting games available at the time that you could literally get stuck into. I remember when we used to rent out the PlayStation at the weekends, we'd actually, the odd time you'd actually rent out a couple of fighting games, because the fighting games, yes, they are short in terms of the campaigns, but they're really good for, like, say, if you're playing against your mates, and just for, like, say, an overnight or just a weekend kind of playthrough. You definitely get a good bit of fun, especially these type of games back in the day. That was really the time to really kind of play them, when you were renting them out. To play them probably over long term, probably not as much, because after a while you probably wouldn't want to play them. You probably kind of nearly get kind of tired of them after a while. But they were really good for a quick playthrough, especially on the weekends with your mates and stuff like that. Even though the campaigns offered a lot of challenges, but they were quite difficult. If anything, I always found the best fun I got from these games would be, like, literally sitting playing with my brothers and my mates and that. A load of us would gather around the house and we just sit for a good few hours, literally just trying to keep playing this here, either playing through the campaign or doing one-on-one fights against each other, and say the winner stays on. As long as someone wins, they keep playing until they lose, pretty much, and then someone else have a go. And so you used to have a good laugh with that. So that's where these games really kind of excelled in their own right. And this here will be an example of that. Now, I never got to play this exact title back in the day, but from what I have played of it, it does remind me an awful lot of those old classic titles, and it is actually really cool. I do love the graphical style. I do love those old kind of blocky, kind of polygon style graphics back in the day. They really kind of suited the era of the games and what they were trying to do back then. And you can clearly see the possibilities of how they were able to, like, say, utilise moves and game mechanics and physics, that it was actually way ahead of its time when you think of it. So it was really well done. So from what I have played of it, this actually is a good game. It is actually quite a good fighting game. It takes a good bit of getting used to, but there's definitely a lot there. If you can stick with the mechanics and get used to how it plays, you'll actually have a bit of enjoyment with this. It is actually a decent fighting game, I have to admit. And it, like, again, it does give you a massive throwback to games of old, back in the day. So if you're into these type of games, I highly recommend giving Fighters Impact a go. Especially if you would, even just for nostalgia reasons. It's definitely a decent game. As you can see here, it definitely got a lot more difficult. No matter what I seemed to try and do, I couldn't actually get the better of the opponents. They seem to be able to counteract everything. They know exactly what you're going to do. They do learn and adapt very quickly to how your play style. So that's what makes it all the more difficult. So it does get very, very hard to win fights. But it's still, again, worthwhile to try it out, like I mentioned, if you are into these games. So I highly recommend that you look into it. So what are your thoughts of Fighter's Impact? Did you actually manage to play it back in the day? And if so, what did you think of it? What are your experiences on it? Make sure to let me know down in the comments below. So if you have enjoyed this video, make sure to leave a like. Also subscribe to the channel and hit that bell icon to be updated whenever I release future videos, as I will be exploring other games like this I never got to play back in the day, but also replaying old classic games and sharing my memories with all of you. So as always, keep playing those classic games and enjoying them, and make sure to keep those gaming memories alive.